The geese belonging to Sam raised such a dreadful racket well before sunrise that fully half the village woke up with a start. Sam bolted out of his farmhouse barefoot, struggling into his homespun woolen coat on the run, and froze right in the middle of the dusty yard. The gate stood half open, and his plumpest geese were already parading through neighbour Ivan's vegetable patch, as if they had lived there all their born days. "Well, just as well I needed this blessed headache," he muttered under his breath, and marched forward with heavy steps. Ivan was already waiting on the other side of the split-rail fence, fists firmly planted on his hips. "Sam, you come and get your greedy birds right now. They're trampling my cabbages flat to the dirt," he bellowed so loudly that the hens roosting by the old shed scattered in all directions. "And why in tarnation was your gate unlocked?" Sam shot right back, immediately taking the offensive. "Because decent folk live here, not the sort who send their feathered beasts over to torment a neighbour." Ivan didn't miss a beat. After 18 long years of bitter neighbourhood feuding, they had learned to quarrel so instinctively that half the time they weren't even listening to what the other fellow was saying. The golden rule was never to give an inch. Priscilla stepped out onto the front porch. Sam's good wife wiped her flour-dusted hands on her worn linen apron and let out a heavy sigh. Here it went again, plain as day. From the adjoining farmstead, Martha poked her head over the fence. "Your geese started this whole ruckus first," she snapped without a second thought. "And nothing on God's green earth is going to save your ruined cabbages now," Priscilla fired back just as sharp. It seemed even the womenfolk had long since forgotten what the original bone of contention was, yet they backed their men with fierce, unyielding devotion. Across the dirt road, 2 neighbour women carrying heavy wooden buckets had come to a dead halt. They weren't in any earthly hurry. Sam and Ivan's morning shouting matches were far more entertaining than the county newspaper. "Last week they were at each other's throats over windfall and apples," whispered the first woman, leaning on her pail. "That's small potatoes, Martha. Don't you remember the time they didn't speak for 3 solid days on account of a stray nanny goat?" replied the second. Meanwhile, Sam was already wading into the cabbages, snatching up his hissing geese while muttering fierce curses under his breath. Ivan paced up and down the rows, loudly tallying imaginary damages. "Look right here, will you?" he demanded, pointing an accusing finger at a large cabbage head. "What am I supposed to be looking at?" Sam snorted, rolling his eyes. "It used to be straight as an arrow, and now look at it, it's crooked as a dog's hind leg." The shouting match could easily have stretched all the way through dinner had young Peter not loped down the road just then. Tall and broad-shouldered, the stracking lad was wheeling a heavy handcart piled high with grain sacks. Catching sight of his father locked in yet another furious battle with Sam, he merely shook his head in weary disbelief. "Pa, for goodness' sake, can't you ever let up about those pesky geese?" he called out. "Ha! Look at that! That just proves my boy's got a head on his shoulders!" Ivan immediately shouted at the top of his lungs so the whole countryside could hear. At that exact moment, Marina emerged from Sam's barn carrying 2 heavy buckets of spring water suspended from a curved wooden yoke across her shoulders. "Smart indeed," she chimed in with a teasing smile. "Same Peter who drove his horse and wagon clean up to the axle in the marshland just last week." The neighbour women standing by the roadside had to clap their hands over their mouths to stifle their laughter. Peter pulled his cart to a halt, his eyes narrowing into suspicious slits. "At least I hauled the rig out by myself, because I had no other choice in this county." "Well, if you weren't so bull-headed, you wouldn't have gotten stuck in the first place, and if you weren't so busy gossiping, you wouldn't have noticed." Sam puffed out his chest with immense pride. "There you have it, Ivan. My Marina always has a clever comeback locked and loaded for any jack-of-all-trades." Ivan merely let out a dismissive snort. "Talk is cheap, and carrying water won't plough a field." Peter opened his mouth to deliver a stinging reply, but Marina flashed a sly, knowing grin, gracefully hoisted her balanced water buckets and tossed over her shoulder. "Just mind you don't drop those precious sacks in the dirt, Master Farmer." She glided down the country road, while Peter stared after her for a long, lingering moment, nursing a stubborn urge to prove that he would have the final word before the sun went down. Little did he know that this very same morning squabble would ignite an entirely new brand of rivalry, one that would soon engulf not just the two headstrong youths, but both of their stubborn families. By midday, the entire village was buzzing with the tale of the dawn war over the wandering geese. Yet Sam and Ivan weren't even thinking about cooling down. On the contrary, each was firmly convinced that he alone had emerged the glorious victor of the verbal sparring match. After finishing his chores out in the back garden, Sam sat down on the rough-hewn front porch bench, picking up an old wooden bucket to mend while casting sidelong glances across the wooden fence into the neighbouring yard. Over on the other side, Ivan was busy instructing young Peter on how to hitch the workhorse to the heavy timber wagon. "You seein' this, Priscilla?" Ivan projected his voice deliberately so it carried clearly across the fence. "Not every young buck in these parts handles a team of horses with such steady hands. We're raising a proper hard-working farmer here." Priscilla merely rolled her eyes upward toward the blue sky. She knew darn well who those honeyed words were intended for. Sam heard every single syllable loud and clear. He sat in dead silence for a minute or two, chewing on a blade of grass, and then bellowed for his daughter. "Marina, come on out here for a spell." The young woman was currently sorting dried beans in the shadowy entryway and stepped out into the sunlit yard. "What is it, Pa?" "Show your mother that embroidered dish towel you finished up yesterday evening." Marina raised her eyebrows in sheer astonishment, but dutifully went inside and fetched the crisp linen piece. Across the white fabric, intricate crimson and black geometric patterns ran in flawless striking rows. Sam took the textile in his calloused hands and raised it high so the neighbours across the fence could catch a clear view. "Now that right there is genuine craftsmanship. You won't find work like that made by just anyone around these parts." Ivan immediately let out a loud mocking snort. "You can't hitch a team of plough horses to an embroidered dish towel." "Maybe not, but a clever woman's good sense is what keeps a whole farmstead running smooth as butter," retorted Sam. "A proper farm is kept by a man, provided he has a sensible woman standing behind him, not lecturing him." Hearing those sharp words, Martha burst out of her kitchen and slammed the heavy oak door shut with a resounding bang, as if determined to cast her own weighted vote into the ongoing dispute. Peter kept right on working in silence by the wagon, but Marina was already looking over at him with that familiar, mocking little smile that always drove him clean out of his mind. She knew full well that whenever their parents started pitting their children against one another, it never ended in peace and quiet. It had always been this way. Years ago, Ivan had boasted all over the county that Peter was the very first lad in their generation to learn how to ride bareback. In retaliation, Sam spent a solid month telling every living soul at the general store how Marina had learned to tally figures at the county market faster than any other girl her age. Then came the year Peter raised a prize-winning colt. In swift response, Sam paraded half the township past his fence just to gaze upon Marina's dairy cow. Nobody could quite remember who had fired the opening salvo in this generational war, but the fierce competition had dragged on for so many years that it felt as permanent and reliable as the sunrise. Later that same afternoon, Peter loaded several heavy grain sacks into the wooden barn loft. As his wagon clattered past the old village stone well, he caught sight of Marina. She was standing there alone, drawing a fresh bucket of cold water. "Word on the dusty road is that you came out on top of our little debate this morning once again," he asked, leaning against the rough stone rim. "So the gossips say," Marina replied, flashing a cool, teasing smile. "What's the matter, Peter? Have you started listening to idle village chatter now?" "Heavens, no. It's just that my pa won't stop grumbling into his porridge all morning long. Mine's doing the exact same thing in our kitchen." They fell silent for a brief, quiet second. Strange as it felt, for the first time in their lives, both realized they were saddled with the exact same burdensome predicament, their overly competitive, stubborn fathers. But the sweet truce lasted barely a heartbeat. "All the same, your fancy embroidered towel isn't going to pull a plough through the spring mud," Peter quipped with a lopsided grin. "And your plough horse certainly isn't talented enough to embroider a wedding cloth," Marina shot right back without missing a single beat. Peter let out a reluctant chuckle, though he tried hard to swallow it back, while Marina hoisted her water buckets onto her wooden shoulder yoke and sauntered off down the dusty lane. Just then, Old Man Wiley, sitting quietly beneath the gnarled shade of the orchard pear tree, suddenly looked up after the retreating pair and muttered softly to himself, "Lord Almighty, if only those two young fools had any earthly idea that their fathers used to be such thick as thieves back in the day that they wouldn't even drink a cup of well water without the other." But those quiet words melted away into the afternoon breeze, heard by no one at all. Only the old man continued to gaze long and hard at the two neighboring farmsteads, pondering how some bitter old grudges managed to outlive the very people who planted them. And sure enough, by the very next morning, a fresh incident would arrive to remind everyone in the county of the eternal neighborhood feud. The dawn sun had barely cleared the weathered barn roofs when the old rivalry reared its ugly head once more. Sam had just stepped out into the barnyard, carrying a galvanized bucket filled with golden corn for his morning poultry, when he heard Ivan's outraged voice ringing out loud and clear from over the wooden partition. "Sam, get your lazy bones over here right this blessed minute!" Over 18 years of feuding, Sam had learned to gauge the exact magnitude of a neighborly catastrophe purely by the sheer volume of Ivan's morning roar. Judging by the current racket, it sounded nothing short of the biblical apocalypse. "Now what in tarnation has broken loose this time?" Sam grumbled in deep disgust, dragging his heavy boots across the dirt toward the dividing fence. Ivan was standing dramatically next to a young apple sapling, pointing an accusing finger at a single snapped branch. "You seein' this right here with your own eyes?" "I'm looking right at it," Sam sighed. "Well, your wretched stray goat did this dirty work." Sam blinked several times in utter confusion. "I don't even own a goat, Ivan. You've completely lost your marbles." Ivan fell silent for a fleeting moment, glaring at the foliage. "Then it was your mangy laying hen." "A hen snapped a sturdy apple branch in half? Get real, man." "Then I don't rightly know whose fault it is, but it sure as hell came off your side of the fence." Priscilla, who happened to be sweeping the front porch steps at that very instant, had to clap her mouth to keep from howling with laughter. Even Marina, carrying a bucket of wash water toward the summer kitchen, managed to conceal a wide, triumphant grin. But Ivan was dead serious. Within a matter of minutes, both families were lined up along the length of the wooden partition, exchanging fiery glares. "This prized apple tree is worth more to my peace of mind than some of my actual neighbors," Ivan declared, puffing out his chest. "Then why don't you march on over there and strike up a deep conversation with the trunk, since it's got more sense than you do?" Sam shot back instantly. "Arguing with you is like talking to a brick wall because you refuse to listen to plain logic." The shouting match flared hotter and hotter until Old Man Wiley happened to stroll down the public road and intervened with a weary wave of his hand. "Oh, for the love of heaven, leave that poor apple tree in peace, you old coots. I'm old enough to remember the exact afternoon when the two of you planted those very saplings side by side as brothers." An absolute dead silence fell over the yard. It lasted barely a fraction of a second. Ivan was the first to let out a harsh defensive snort. "That was ancient history, Wiley." "Ancient history, indeed," Sam echoed quickly, clearing his throat. But for some inexplicable reason, both grizzled men immediately cast their eyes down at the dusty dirt. Peter noticed it, and so did Marina. It wasn't the first time they had overheard fleeting whispers hinting that their fathers had once been inseparable friends before some forgotten falling out. Yet inside their respective homes, nobody ever dared speak a single word about those bygone days, as if that entire era of peace had never existed at all. After dinner, the entire village turned out for a communal community road-clearing bee to shovel away the deep ruts and mud left behind by the recent spring rains. Even though Sam and Ivan went out of their way to give each other a wide berth, the nature of the labor forced them to work practically shoulder to shoulder. Barely an hour had passed before a brand new contest flared up between the two old rivals. "My Peter has already cleared half the stretch of road by himself," Ivan boasted loudly to the surrounding neighbors, "because the boy swings a heavy shovel like a roaring windmill." "Well, my Marina clears the road with her head and sharp wits, not just raw muscle that tires out before the morning dew dries," Sam countered swiftly. "Let her use her wits to shovel gravel then. At least she won't be wheezing like an old bellows after 10 minutes of honest work." Hearing this jab, Peter rolled his eyes toward the heavens in sheer exasperation. Marina did the exact same thing. They had long since grown accustomed to the exhausting reality that any honest day's labor, sooner or later, was destined to be twisted into a petty parental pissing contest. And the worst part of it all was that their fathers genuinely expected them to secure absolute victory at every single turn. Late in the afternoon, as the community work bee was finally winding down, Peter was busy heaving large field stones onto the back of his wooden cart. Suddenly, the left wooden wheel dropped hard into a deep rain-washed rut along the grassy shoulder. The heavy wagon lurched violently to one side, and a massive 100-pound burlap sack of gravel slipped from the stack, tumbling directly toward him. Peter didn't even have enough time to leap backward out of harm's way, but a pair of strong hands suddenly seized the heavy fabric of his coarse work shirt, yanking him violently sideways. With a heavy, muffled thud, the massive sack crashed into the dirt right where Peter had been standing a mere heartbeat before. Peter spun around in a daze. Standing right beside him, dusting off her hands, was Marina. "Are you completely blind, or were you just trying to get yourself crushed for sport?" she scolded, her cheeks flushed. "I could have handled it perfectly fine by myself, thank you very much." "Oh, absolutely. I forgot you're invincible. Not that I'm asking for a tearful thank you note anyway." With that, she spun on her heel and marched away down the road, leaving him standing in the dust beside the leaning wagon. Peter stared after her retreating figure far longer than he had originally planned. Walking all the way home in the gathering dusk, it dawned on him for the very first time that lately Marina had a frustrating habit of popping up right beside him precisely when he found himself tumbling headfirst into trouble. And even though he instantly tried to banish the thought from his head, he knew deep down that come market day in a couple of days, this peculiar game of competitive cat and mouse was going to reach a whole new boiling point. There were only 2 days left before the grand county fair, and the entire countryside was consumed with frantic preparations. Well before dawn broke over the thatched roofs, wooden farm wagons creaked along the lanes. Farm wives meticulously sorted their harvest goods, and the menfolk calculated what they could sell for top dollar at the public square. But in 2 particular adjoining farmsteads, the fair preparations had long since degenerated into yet another full-blown athletic and mercantile contest. Sam stood right in the middle of his farmyard, meticulously inspecting gleaming rows of crimson hand-polished apples arranged inside woven wicker baskets. "Marina's going to sell out every last apple before the dinner bell even rings today," he announced loudly to the empty air, pitching his voice so it sailed right over the dividing fence for Ivan's benefit. Ivan was busy greasing the wooden axle of his hay wagon on the other side. "First, she needs to learn how to haggle with real customers instead of just flapping her jaws like my Peter does with his hands. My daughter will earn more hard coin with her silver tongue than your boy ever will with his heavy lifting. We shall see about that, old man, we shall surely see." Priscilla really shook her head in quiet resignation. She could predict almost every single one of their predictable verbal sparring matches weeks in advance. The strangest part of it all was that both grown men squabbled with such fierce, burning passion as if the economic survival of the entire North American continent rested squarely on a country fair. Peter was busy leading his sturdy roan horse out of the dark timber stable when he overheard yet another competitive barb tossed over the timber fence. "Here it goes again," he muttered under his breath. "And when, pray tell, did it ever stop?" Martha asked with a wry, knowing smile. But Peter had grown utterly immune to it. For as long as he could remember, his entire existence had been perpetually measured against Marina's achievements. If he mastered a new farming skill, Sam immediately found a flimsy pretext to praise his daughter to the skies. If Marina achieved something noteworthy in the village, Ivan instantly brought up his son's superior physical strength. At first it had made Peter's blood boil, then it became an irritating nuisance, and finally it simply settled into an inescapable part of everyday country life. Meanwhile, Marina was busy packing wicker baskets with crisp apples near the old wooden granary when the left wooden wheel of her handcart suddenly gave a sharp crack and buckled awkwardly to the side. "Well now, if that isn't the crowning touch to my blessed week," she sighed, resting her hands on her hips. Sam scratched the back of his neck in deep annoyance. "We've got to patch it up right now, otherwise we won't make it to the fairgrounds by dawn."